This is just the beginning. Subscribe so you don't miss where we go next. In 1991, over 14,000 people were pulled out of a collapsing capital city in just 36 hours, the largest single-operation aircraft evacuation ever recorded. One plane alone carried 1,088 passengers, seats stripped from the cabin to fit more bodies in, a number that still stands as a record today. Israel's government moved an entire population across a continent in less than 2 days because its highest rabbinic authorities believed these were the descendants of an ancient Israelite king, exiled for more than 2,500 years and finally coming home. That belief, codified in law, ratified by rabbis, acted on by a government, was the entire justification for Operation Solomon. So when geneticists finally sat down decades later with cheek swabs and sequencing machines, expecting to trace an ancient Middle Eastern bloodline all the way back to Jerusalem, what they found didn't match the story. Not loosely, not partially, it didn't match at all. If the genetics don't show a single drop of ancient Israelite blood, what did Israel actually airlift out of Ethiopia in 1991? And does it even matter? But to understand what the lab results eventually turned up, you have to understand the story this community told about itself for 2,000 years first. A story about a queen, a king, and a son born in secret. They call themselves Beta Israel, the House of Israel, an Ethiopian Jewish community rooted for centuries in the highlands around Gondar and the shores of Lake Tana. Their own tradition, passed down orally and eventually written into the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings, a Ge'ez language text compiled and canonized in the 14th century, tells a specific origin. They descend from Menelik I, the son born from a union between King Solomon of Israel and the Queen of Sheba. It's not a minor legend, it's the origin story of an empire. Ethiopia's Solomonic dynasty used this genealogy for centuries to legitimize its throne. The emperors claimed Menelik personally carried the Ark of the Covenant out of Jerusalem and into Ethiopia, and rulers traced an unbroken royal line back to him all the way into the 20th century. Haile Selassie's own imperial title referenced this same lineage. This wasn't folklore whispered in villages. It was state doctrine. There's a second competing tradition inside the community itself, one that doesn't involve Solomon at all. Descent from the tribe of Dan, one of the 10 northern tribes of the Kingdom of Israel scattered after the Assyrian conquest, roughly in the 8th century BCE. Two different origin stories, 2 different centuries, 2 different mechanisms, and both used to explain the same community. What made either story plausible to outsiders wasn't just the legend, it was the practice. For centuries, Beta Israel kept Torah-based law with no Talmud, no rabbinic Judaism, no contact with the wider Jewish world at all. Priestly figures called kahanat conducting animal sacrifice, following a form of Judaism that looked frozen in an earlier era, untouched by the developments that shaped Judaism everywhere else on earth. To many observers, that isolation was the proof. A Judaism this old-fashioned, this cut-off, had to be ancient. It had to be real. It had to trace back. The rabbinic world eventually agreed, twice, centuries apart. In 1538, Rabbi David ibn Zimra, known as the Radbaz, one of the most significant legal authorities of his era, based in Egypt, issued a formal responsum accepting the community as authentically Jewish, specifically descended from the tribe of Dan. That ruling sat mostly unused for 4 centuries. Then in 1973, Israel's chief Sephardic rabbi, Ovadia Yosef, issued his own ruling formally recognizing Beta Israel as Jews of the tribe of Dan, a decision that carried enormous legal weight because it opened the door for mass immigration under Israel's law of return. That single ruling, more than any other document, is the reason Operation Solomon happened in 1991 at all. Here's the part the legend, the law, and the politics all conveniently left out. None of it, not the Kebra Nagast, not the Radbaz's 1538 ruling, not Ovadia Yosef's 1973 recognition, was based on a single shred of biological evidence. It was story. It was legal precedent. It was diplomacy. Nobody had actually looked at the DNA yet. Then, starting in the late 20th century and accelerating in the 2000s, scientists finally got to ask the one question no legend, no responsum, and no imperial title could ever answer. What does the blood actually say? Dr. Doron Behar and his colleagues answered part of that question in 2008 in a major study published in PLOS One titled Counting the Founders, analyzing maternal genetic lineages across Jewish populations worldwide, Beta Israel included. Maternal DNA, mitochondrial DNA, passed down only from mother to child, generation after generation, largely untouched by the mixing that happens with every new marriage. Works almost like a genetic mailing address. pointing back toward wherever a woman's female ancestors originally lived. And Beta Israel's mailing address wasn't Jerusalem. Their maternal haplogroups were overwhelmingly L0 through L3 lineages, the same lineages found broadly across sub-Saharan and East African populations generally. Not the Near Eastern founder lineages found in Ashkenazi Jews, not the ones found in Sephardi Jews, not the ones found in Mizrahi Jews. A different signature entirely. 2 years later, in 2010, Behar's team escalated the finding with a genome-wide study, this time comparing Beta Israel's full autosomal DNA, not just the maternal line, but the broader genetic inheritance from both parents, directly against neighboring non-Jewish Ethiopian populations like the Amhara and Tigray, and separately against other Jewish diaspora groups scattered across the world. The result? Beta Israel clustered tightly with their non-Jewish Ethiopian neighbors, not with Ashkenazi Jews, not with Sephardi Jews, not even with Yemenite Jews, a community living just across the narrow stretch of the Red Sea. Here is where it gets complicated, because the priesthood only sharpens the problem. Beta Israel maintained a hereditary priestly class, the Kahanat, for centuries. And in other Jewish populations, hereditary priesthood correlates with a specific, traceable Y chromosome signature, passed father to son, the so-called Cohen modal haplotype, associated with haplogroup J1, found at notably elevated frequency among men who identify as Kohanim in Ashkenazi and Sephardi communities. Researchers are careful to frame the exact frequency of that marker within Beta Israel's own Kahanat lineage, specifically as still requiring confirmation against the underlying data. This is probability being discussed here, not a settled certainty. But the broader paternal picture is not in dispute. Beta Israel Y chromosome lineages are dominated instead by haplogroup E1b1b, the single most common paternal lineage across the entire Horn of Africa, a signature essentially indistinguishable from the non-Jewish Ethiopian men living in the very same villages. Clean, consistent, expected, if you're looking at an Ethiopian population, not if you're looking for Jerusalem. And here's the twist. The isolation itself was supposed to prevent the very thing Beta Israel pointed to as proof of ancient purity. No intermarriage, no contact with the wider Jewish world, centuries of total isolation, is, genetically, evidence of the opposite kind of story. Real isolation preserves signatures. If this community's ancestors had actually walked out of ancient Israel, or filtered down even indirectly through Yemen, some trace of that Middle Eastern lineage should have survived the centuries, buried but detectable, the way it survives in isolated Jewish populations elsewhere in the world. There isn't one. Not a trace. Not a fragment. Nothing. So if the ancient migration story doesn't hold up inside the genome itself, where did a fully formed, Torah-observant, priest-led Jewish community in the middle of the Ethiopian highlands actually come from? The first theory says, nowhere outside Ethiopia at all. Historian Stephen Kaplan of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, in his landmark 1992 study, The Beta Israel, Falasha in Ethiopia, argued that the community emerged from within Ethiopia itself, a religious movement rising out of Aga-speaking populations, likely sometime between the 14th and 16th centuries, adopting a Hebraic, Old Testament-centered religious identity, specifically in opposition to the expanding Ethiopian Orthodox Christian state. The raw material for that identity, Kaplan pointed out, was already sitting right there in the regional culture. Ethiopian Christianity itself has always been unusually Judaizing by world standards, observing a Saturday Sabbath, practicing circumcision, following dietary restrictions, venerating the Ark of the Covenant as a living national symbol. A Torah-centered identity didn't need to be imported from Israel. The ingredients for one were already baked into Ethiopian religious life. Kaplan's timeline places the crystallization of a distinct Beta Israel identity, specifically as a population excluded from land ownership under the Ethiopian state, into the 14th and 15th centuries. That's over 2,000 years after the Solomon and Sheba story is even set, in the 10th century BCE, and centuries after the Assyrian exile of the tribe of Dan in the 8th century BCE. The dates simply don't line up with either founding legend. It's a compelling theory, and it explains the religious practice remarkably well. What it doesn't fully explain are the smaller, stranger details, the specific liturgical structure, the Ge'ez language religious texts known as the Orit, and isolated fragments some linguists still flag as showing possible Semitic language influence. Details that remain, by researchers' own admission, unresolved. Kaplan's theory says this was homegrown religion, not homegrown bloodline, But it doesn't explain everything, because there's a second, more complicated explanation, one that even Kaplan's critics say can't be fully ruled out, and it involves actual, if far smaller, contact across that stretch of the Red Sea. That contact, if it happened at all, ran through a strait so narrow you can see one continent from the other's shoreline, and through a kingdom most people have never heard of, because history mostly forgot to keep records of Jewish kings in Arabia. The second theory looks toward the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the tightest crossing point between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, a trade corridor that had already moved people, goods, and ideas across that water for centuries before anyone wrote down a word about Beta Israel. Some scholars propose that small numbers of Jewish or Judaizing traders and settlers from pre-Islamic South Arabia could have carried religious ideas, and a limited amount of ancestry, into the Ethiopian highlands. This isn't speculation about a random detail. There was a real, documented Jewish kingdom on the Arabian side of that water, the Himyarite kingdom, whose last ruler, Yusuf Asar Yathar, converted to Judaism in the early 6th century CE and led a Jewish state until it fell to the Christian kingdom of Aksum, Ethiopia's own predecessor, around 525 CE. That's not folklore. That's a documented military and religious collision, Ethiopia and Yemenite Judaism in direct, violent contact, at exactly the period when Beta Israel's identity may have been taking shape. It's a clean theory. It has a kingdom, a king, a conquest, a date. And the genetic evidence still won't cooperate with it. A direct mtDNA comparison between Yemenite Jewish and Ethiopian Jewish populations found the two groups clearly, measurably distinct from one another. Not close cousins separated by a short sea crossing, but genetically separate populations with separate histories. If Beta Israel's ancestors had come from, or even mixed significantly with, Yemenite Jewish communities, that relationship should show up in the data. It doesn't. Here's where it gets strange, in a way that actually helps make sense of things rather than confusing them further. This doesn't kill Theory 1. It complicates Theory 2 down to something much smaller, and in doing that, it quietly strengthens the case for homegrown identity. If Red Sea contact happened at all, the data suggests it moved as ideas, Sabaean religious influence, trade-borne concepts, maybe a handful of people, without moving enough biology to leave a genetic footprint centuries later. Contact of ideas, not contact of bloodlines. Two theories that once looked like rivals turn out to be compatible, once you take blood out of the equation and leave only belief. But there's a third possibility, and it has nothing to do with trade routes or ancient kingdoms. It has everything to do with something much harder for any community to hear. The third theory, the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud in plain terms, doesn't ask how ancient Beta Israel's practices are. It asks how ancient Beta Israel, as a defined, closed, endogamous group with sharp boundaries, actually is. A minority position among historians, and explicitly not where Kaplan or most mainstream scholarship lands, proposes that the sharply bounded Beta Israel identity may be considerably more recent than either founding legend claims, potentially consolidating under the specific pressures of 19th and 20th century Ethiopian state discrimination, layered together with sustained outside attention from European and American Jewish activists. Say the name at the center of that theory plainly. Jacques Feitlovich, an early 20th century Jewish scholar and activist, who traveled repeatedly to Ethiopia to study and support the community, and who helped connect them to organizations abroad, including the later American Association for Ethiopian Jews. His work, and the broader wave of Western Jewish attention that followed it, didn't invent Beta Israel's religious practice. Nobody credible argues that. But this theory suggests it may have sharpened, formalized, and helped fix a specific Israelite self-identification, in a form legible to world Jewry, faster and more deliberately than a purely organic, centuries-long evolution would predict. Uncomfortable. Not because it's necessarily true, because it's not fully resolvable either way, and because it implicates outsiders in shaping, not just discovering, how a community came to describe itself. Most historians still place the deeper religious roots in the medieval period, not the 19th century. Researchers are careful to frame this third theory as a possibility worth investigating, not a settled conclusion. Whatever the truth of the earliest chapters, Solomonic, Danite, homegrown, Red Sea adjacent, or partly modern, one place makes all of it suddenly, physically real. Not a manuscript, not a lab, a footpath. Picture the highland trails outside Gondar in 1984, dropping from cool highland air into dry lowland scrubland, the route toward the Sudanese border that took families 2 to 4 weeks on foot. Picture walking mostly at night, children carried, religious texts carried, moving to avoid detection by Mengistu's government forces, who did not want this migration happening. Roughly 4,000 people are estimated to have died somewhere along that specific route, from violence, from starvation, from disease, before ever reaching a refugee camp on the other side of the border. That number gets stated plainly here, not because it needs dramatizing, but because it doesn't. It carries its own weight. Those who survived the walk faced months, sometimes years, inside Sudanese refugee camps, treated with suspicion as both foreigners and as Jews. Waiting on a covert airlift some had heard whispered about and most had not. Whatever a laboratory would say decades later, thousands of miles away, about mitochondrial haplogroups and autosomal clustering, that is not what these specific people were carrying on that walk. They were carrying centuries of religious practice, a name for themselves, and a direction to keep walking in. And that walk is exactly where the twist in this story lands hardest. Because the thing that got them airlifted out of Ethiopia was never actually the thing the geneticists eventually found. Here is the part the records genuinely didn't see coming. Israel's rulings in 1973 and 1975, recognizing Beta Israel as Jews under the law of return. The rulings that triggered operations Moses, Joshua, and Solomon, and the rescue of more than 20,000 people across those operations combined, were made entirely on religious and legal grounds. Years before anyone had sequenced a single strand of Beta Israel DNA. The decision came first. The biology came decades later. And when the biology finally did arrive in 2008 and again in 2010, it didn't just fail to confirm the Solomon and Sheba story, or the lost tribe of Dan story. It went further than a simple non-confirmation. It actively showed that Beta Israel are genetically closest to their non-Jewish Ethiopian neighbors, closer to them than to any Jewish population anywhere on earth. Yemenite Jews across the narrow strait included. Sit with what that actually means, because it cuts a different way than it first appears to. The rescue remains valid. The religious status remains valid. The citizenship remains valid. None of it was ever contingent on ancestry in the first place. It was built on 13 generations of practiced law, communal memory, and lived religious identity, not on a verifiable drop of Middle Eastern blood. The DNA didn't just fail to prove the myth that carried this case for over 400 years, from the Radbaz's ruling in 1538 to Ovadia Yosef's ruling in 1973. It proved something considerably more radical sitting underneath the myth, that the question of who counts as a Jew was never primarily a genetic question to begin with, even though everyone involved, for 4 centuries, argued as if it were. Today, more than 135,000 Ethiopian Jews live in Israel, an entire diaspora community whose citizenship and religious standing rest on centuries of practiced law and shared memory, not on a single confirmed strand of Middle Eastern ancestry. One elder who made that walk in 1984, asked years later by a researcher recording oral histories what he thought when he finally learned what the DNA studies had found, is said to have answered simply that the blood was never what made him keep the Sabbath for 60 years. The keeping was what made him who he was. Composite as that kind of moment often is, across dozens of similar interviews, it captures something the lab results can't touch either way. Which leaves a much bigger question sitting underneath this one specific community. A question that applies to almost every group of people who has ever called themselves a nation, a tribe, or a people. Nearly every founding origin story humanity has ever told itself, Solomonic dynasties, lost tribes, chosen peoples, noble unbroken bloodlines, was written by people who had no way to test it, and who very often had every political reason to want it to be true anyway. Genetics has now run this same reversal on dozens of populations worldwide. Communities whose self-told ancestry turns out to be more recent, more constructed, and more about shared practice than shared blood, while the blood itself, underneath the story, tells an older, messier, far more local history than anyone had claimed. Identity, it turns out, was never really stored in a double helix. It was stored in what a community chose, generation after generation, to keep doing, keep believing, and keep calling itself. Closer to a river reshaping its own banks over centuries than to a fixed inscription carved once in stone. So did scientists really solve the Ethiopian Jewish DNA mystery after centuries of debate? They solved the biology. The identity itself was never really the mystery to begin with. And that river is still running, right now, in more than 135,000 lives that make the same choice today that their community made 1,000 years before any lab could weigh in.